What do you think of when you stand in the middle of a schoolyard? Laughter, the rustle of pages, or a bright future? But what would happen if beneath the green grass where children once ran and played, there were thousands of unnamed skeletons with no farewell? Why would a place built for education become a mass grave hidden for more than a century? How could thousands of children disappear from history without leaving any official trace, until ground-penetrating radar forced the Earth itself to speak? Today, we are going to uncover the darkest chapter in Canada's history, the tragedy of the Indigenous residential schools, a journey in search of justice for forgotten souls, where the truth is more painful than any horror film you have ever seen. May 2021, Kamloops, British Columbia, Canada. A group of specialists is moving slowly across the grounds of a former school. Careful footsteps, eyes fixed on the screens of handheld computers. Beneath their feet lies lush green grass, level, quiet, ordinary, like any suburban backyard in Canada. The device they are using is ground-penetrating radar, GPR, capable of seeing through meters of dense earth to detect what lies below. The screen begins to flicker. One anomaly, then another, and another. The technician stops, looks more closely at the screen, looks down at the ground beneath their feet, then back at the screen. Within hours, the number is confirmed. 215. 215 anomalies consistent with human remains. Small, most no longer than a meter, lying silently beneath the soil of the former Kamloops Indian Residential School grounds. 215 children. No grave markers, no names, no dates, no sign on the surface that would tell anyone what lay beneath. Right beneath that ordinary patch of lush green grass were children who had once lived, once laughed, once called for their mothers in a language no one in that school allowed them to speak. The news spread within hours. Canada, a country that often prides itself on being one of the most civilized, progressive, and rights-respecting places in the world, was stunned. But for the Secwepemc people of Kamloops, for First Nations communities across Canada, this was not news. It was confirmation of what they had known for a long time. It was confirmation of what their grandparents had told them, stories no one wanted to hear, memories no one wanted to verify, wounds no one wanted to admit were real. The land does not lie. And that night, across Canada, people placed children's shoes in front of government buildings, church gates, and courthouse steps. Thousands of small shoes. Each pair was a name. Each pair was a life cut short before it could truly begin. And the story, the real story, is far greater than 215. In 1857, Duncan Campbell Scott, a senior official in Canada's Department of Indian Affairs, summed up the goal of policy toward Indigenous peoples in one sentence. Our objective is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic. And the phrase, the whole world has come to know, attributed to Colonel Richard Henry Pratt, founder of the first boarding school model in the United States, and a direct inspiration for Canada's system. Kill the Indian in the child. This was not a metaphor, not a figure of speech. This was policy. It had a budget. It had an administrative structure. It had thousands of people carrying it out. Beginning in 1883, the Canadian government worked with Christian churches, mainly Catholic, Anglican, Methodist, and Presbyterian, to establish a network of Indian residential schools across the country. The model was very simple. Remove Indigenous children from their communities, as early as possible, as far away as possible, and place them in an environment completely cut off from everything they had ever known. Language, culture, names, religion, a way of understanding the world. All of it had to be erased. And in its place came English, the Bible, and obedience. This system officially existed from 1883 to 1996, only 29 years before you read this sentence. Over more than a century, an estimated 150,000 Indigenous children passed through this system. Let me describe to you what thousands of Indigenous families in Canada went through, not once, but year after year, over many decades. Late summer. A wagon, later a car, appears at the edge of the village. Inside are government officials, sometimes accompanied by police. They have come to take the children, not to pick them up for school. There is no parental consent. There is no choice. Canadian law required Indigenous parents to surrender their children of certain ages to residential schools. Families who refused, the parents would be jailed. Mary Swifthawk, a survivor who testified before Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, recalled, "My mother held me so tightly, I could feel her heart beating. Then they pulled me away. I looked back and saw her collapsing. I did not know that was the last time I would hear her voice." The children, sometimes only 5 or 6 years old, were put on vehicles and taken away. Sometimes to schools hundreds of kilometers from home. Sometimes they went through an entire Canadian winter without a single letter, without a single phone call, without any contact with their families. Because contact with family was forbidden. What did the Kamloops Residential School, the school beneath whose grounds 215 children were found in 2021, look like when a 7-year-old child first entered it in the fall of, say, 1940? Right in the entrance hall, the child was separated. Nuns or staff, dressed in stern uniforms, not speaking a single word in the child's language, began the intake process. First, the hair was cut. For many Indigenous peoples, hair carries deep spiritual meaning, a symbol of identity, connection to ancestors, sometimes cut only when a loved one dies. Forcibly cutting it was a deliberate act of erasure. For the child, it was the first terror. Next, the name was changed. The name given by the parents, carrying meaning, family history, the voice of a people, was taken away. In its place came an English name, sometimes just a number. You were no longer Kaya or Ahanu or Ayana. You were Mary. You were John. You were number 47. Then the clothes were changed. The clothes brought from home, sometimes sewn by the mother's own hands, were confiscated and burned or locked away in storage. Within a few hours, the child no longer had their own name, their own hair, or their own clothes. And all of it happened in a language the child did not understand at all. The absolute rule of every residential school: no speaking your mother tongue. Not discouraged, not limited, absolutely forbidden, with punishments designed to inflict enough physical and psychological pain that the child would never dare violate the rule a second time. In testimony before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, survivors described the punishments. Being struck on the hands with wooden rulers or leather straps until they could no longer hold anything. Having soap rubbed into the mouth and across the tongue, a punishment specifically reserved for the crime of speaking their mother tongue, as though their language were something filthy that needed to be scrubbed away. Being locked alone in a dark room overnight. Being forced to kneel on a cold concrete floor for hours. Charlie Thompson, a survivor, 78 years old when he testified, recalled, "One time I whispered a sentence my grandmother had taught me, the sentence I said every night before sleeping, to remember home. The teacher heard it. She dragged me to the front of the class, forced my mouth open, and rubbed soap inside. I vomited, I cried, but she did not stop. After that, for weeks, I said nothing at all. I did not speak English either. I was just silent." After years in that system, many children forgot their mother tongue, not because they wanted to, but because the human brain, especially a child's brain, eventually lets go of what is never used, what causes pain every time it is remembered. When they returned home, if they returned home, they could no longer speak with their parents. Not because they did not want to, but because they no longer shared a language. But all of that, the haircutting, the renaming, the banning of language, was only the tip of the iceberg. What lay beneath was colder, darker, and far more violent. The residential schools were funded by the state, but that funding was often cut, siphoned off, and never enough to maintain even minimum living conditions for children. The buildings were often damp, without enough heat in the Canadian winter, where temperatures below -30 degrees Celsius are not rare. Children slept in large dormitories with thin blankets, wearing clothes that were not warm enough. The food is described in many testimonies as insufficient in quantity and poor in quality. Thin porridge, stale bread, sometimes spoiled food. Meanwhile, white staff and teachers ate better in the same building. The inevitable result: disease spread. Tuberculosis was the great silent killer in the residential school system. Crowded living conditions, malnutrition, poor hygiene, and lack of medical care created the perfect environment for TB to spread. In some residential schools, death rates from tuberculosis reached 40 to 60% during the worst outbreaks, higher than the death rate of Canadian soldiers in World War II. Read that number again. 40 to 60% of the children in some of these schools died. Not because of war, not because of natural disaster, but because of living conditions created and maintained by the very people running the schools. People who claim to represent civilization and Christianity. This is the part many survivors needed decades to speak about, because the shame, fear, and silence planted in them in childhood ran too deep to overcome easily. Physical abuse was systematic and open, an official tool of discipline. Beatings were not a last resort, but a first and frequent one. But sexual abuse, by teachers, priests, staff, is something tens of thousands of survivors testified about, and something records of the Catholic Church, some of which emerged through civil lawsuits, show was known and concealed for many decades. And there is one part of this story that even people who follow the history of residential schools often do not know. From the 1940s into the early 1950s, the Canadian government worked with scientists to use children in residential schools as subjects in nutrition experiments. There was no consent, no notification to families. In these experiments, researchers deliberately starved some groups of children while feeding others normally, to compare the effects of malnutrition on physical and cognitive development. Documents about these experiments were revealed through the research of historian Ian Mosby in 2013. And they show that even in the years people might imagine were the system's normal years, those children were not regarded as full human beings with full rights and dignity. They were regarded as data. Now we come to the center of the story. When a child died in a residential school, from disease, from malnutrition, from physical or psychological trauma, what happened? The answer, in thousands of documented cases: nothing. No official notice to the family. No death record properly preserved. No funeral according to the child's people's customs. In many cases, the family received one of two explanations, if they received anything at all. Either your child ran away from school, a convenient explanation that demanded no further accountability, or nothing at all. The child simply never came home, and the family was never told why. Local authorities did not investigate. Police did not investigate. And even when parents came to the school to ask, if they were brave enough and had the means to get there, since many families lived far away, they were often turned away, treated as a nuisance, and given no answers. When a child died, the cost of transporting the body home, if anyone even considered it, usually was not covered. Instead, many schools chose the cheapest and quickest option: bury them on site. Not in a properly maintained cemetery with headstones and full records, but in hastily dug graves on school grounds, sometimes with rough wooden coffins, sometimes with bodies wrapped in cloth and placed in the ground. No ceremony, no family, no marker. And over time, as schools moved, as campuses were rebuilt, as grounds were paved or reseeded with grass, those locations were deliberately erased from memory. No one wanted to remember. After the May 2021 discovery in Kamloops, many other Indigenous communities began conducting GPR surveys at former residential school sites in their regions. The results did not stop there. June 2021, Cowichan tribes in British Columbia found 182 anomalies at the site of St. Anne's School. June 2021, the Battlefords Tribal Council in Saskatchewan announced the discovery of 751 anomalies at the site of the Kamloops Indian Residential School, the largest number made public at that point. July 2021, 182 anomalies at the site of St. Eugene's Mission School in Cranbrook, British Columbia. And then more, and more, and more. By the end of 2022, the combined total from multiple sites had surpassed 4,100, and these were only the sites that had actually been surveyed. Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, after 6 years of collecting evidence and testimony from 2008 to 2015, confirmed the names of 3,201 children who died in the residential school system, and estimated that the real number could be 6,000 or more. Because records are incomplete, records were destroyed, and thousands of cases were never documented at all. One crucial question: why, after more than a century of operation, did the residential school system not have complete records of the children who died in it? The answer has several layers. The first layer: many schools never kept good records from the beginning. These were underfunded institutions run by priests and nuns, often without administrative training, and Indigenous children were not regarded as important enough to document carefully. The second layer: some records were deliberately destroyed, something later inquiries confirmed through the testimony of some church personnel. The third layer: the Catholic Church, which ran more than 70% of the residential schools, refused or delayed in a highly unusual way, handing over documents to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, even after formal requests were made. In 2022, Pope Francis came to Canada and issued an official apology for the Catholic Church's role in the residential school system. But the question of fully surrendering all records has still not been completely resolved. There is something many people do not realize when they think of residential schools as a historical story. The last survivors of that system, people who were sent into residential schools in 1990, 1991, 1992, 1993, 1994, 1995, and whose last school closed in 1996, are still alive. They are not distant historical witnesses. They are in their 30s and 40s. They are raising children. They are working. They carry those wounds into every day of their lives. Survivors who returned home, if they were able to return, came back in a state psychologists call complex trauma. Not a single traumatic event, but years of continuous, repeated trauma during the most important developmental period of a human life. They no longer knew how to speak their people's language, which meant they could not truly speak with parents or grandparents, could not hear traditional stories, could not take part in sacred ceremonies. They were taught that everything belonging to their identity, language, spirituality, tradition, skin color, was shameful, inferior, something to be abandoned. After hearing that every day for years, part of them believed it. They came home without knowing who they were anymore. People who cannot process pain often turn to ways of coping that destroy themselves. In First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities in Canada, rates of alcohol and drug addiction, depression, suicide, and domestic violence are all significantly higher than in Canada's general population. This is often carelessly attributed by commentators to vague cultural factors. But when you understand that the people struggling with these issues are the children and grandchildren of those whom the system deliberately cut off from family, culture, and identity, and that their own parents and grandparents return from those schools with psychological wounds that were untreated, unacknowledged, and unsupported, the picture becomes clearer. Unhealed trauma does not disappear over time. It changes shape. It enters the way people raise children, the way they treat themselves and others, the way they see the world and their place in it. And it passes to the next generation, not necessarily through genes, but through patterns of behavior, attachment, and emotional coping that traumatized parents pass on to their children without ever intending to do so. This is intergenerational trauma, a term modern psychology has confirmed, but one Indigenous peoples in Canada have long understood in simpler language. What was done to our parents, we are still carrying. But this story is not only about pain. Over the past decades, Indigenous communities in Canada have quietly and persistently done the very thing the residential school system tried to destroy: revive their languages and cultures. Elders who survived, those fortunate enough not to have gone through the residential school system, or those who managed to keep their language despite everything, began teaching the younger generation again. Indigenous languages once thought to have been completely erased are being documented, digitized, and taught in schools. Songs, ceremonies, and oral histories are being retold and preserved. And the children who were taken, the children beneath the ground at Kamloops and in thousands of other places, are being named, remembered, and brought home in the ways the material world can no longer provide. In 2015, after 6 years of gathering evidence and testimony, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada released its final report. That report used one word to describe what had happened to Indigenous children in the residential school system: cultural genocide. Not an unfortunate assimilation policy, not the mistakes of another era, not good intentions badly carried out. Cultural genocide. Deliberate, systematic, funded, supported by law, and carried out over more than a century with the participation of the state, the churches, and the justice system. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau issued an official apology in 2008 under Stephen Harper, and again on later occasions. Pope Francis apologized in 2022, but apology does not automatically lead to reconciliation. Reconciliation requires action. The full release of records, funding for communities to conduct GPR surveys at former school sites, psychological and medical support for survivors and their families, and above all, ensuring that Indigenous rights are respected in both law and practice today. That journey is still ongoing, and it is still a very long one. But I want to end not with politics, but with a small story. After news of the 215 children at Kamloops was made public in May 2021, an elderly Secwepemc woman came to stand at the gate of the former school grounds. She stood there in silence for a long time. Then she began to sing, a song in her people's language, a song she said was meant to bring spirits home. Her singing was recorded and spread across Canada within days. No one translated the song into English. It was not necessary. Because there are languages in which grief and love need no translation to be understood. We often take pride in the progress of human civilization. But is that progress worth anything if it is built on the bones, blood, and tears of innocent children torn from their parents' arms? Canada has begun a journey it calls reconciliation. But how many similar secrets in this world still lie beneath the earth, where no radar has yet pointed, where no one has yet stood up to demand the truth? And the final question, a question not for history, but for the present. When we see minority communities, Indigenous peoples, and marginalized groups fighting for the right to teach their children in their own language, practice their own culture, and name their children with the names of their people, which side are we on? The land does not lie, but do we, as human beings, have the courage to hear the whole truth? In memory of all the children who never made it home. Thank you for listening to this story all the way through, and do not forget to like and subscribe to the channel to watch more videos.